If you want to know the major concrete events happening in America for the year 2023, then you definitely want to stick around and watch this video. Hey there, everyone. Mychal Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology, and I am really excited to be sharing with you the Aries Ingress prediction for 2023. The Aries Ingress is a type of predictive method that astrologers use in order to cast a prediction for a country based on the capital city of that country. So I'm going to be bringing you the Aries Ingress for Washington, D.C. for 2023, and I can assure you that it's going to be well worth your time. I'm having a really great time over on Twitter, and I'm finally realizing the utility of Twitter as a social media platform to create conversation and to create dialogue about things that genuinely matter, not just within the astrological community, but also within the world at large. So if you want to soak up some of my astrological ruminations as I look at what's going on in the world around us, then by all means follow me at Oraculos Astro. Announcements, because I definitely want to use this as an opportunity to share some of the exciting things we have going on at the Oraculos School of Astrology this year. The greatest excitement is that I am publishing my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, in a matter of weeks. In a matter of weeks at this point, I'll be publishing my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology. And it's been such an incredible and overwhelming and exciting and nerve-wracking and just love-filled journey. And I can't wait to share the final result of my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, with all of you. So if you want to stay in the loop of everything that's going down with my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, then by all means, make sure to sign up for our newsletter by clicking the link down below. Also, I'm going to be selling signed copies of my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, at this year's NORWAC, #Norwaculos, because what better place to share my new astrological publication than NORWAC? So if you want to come and see your Oraculos family in person, or if you just want to come and share space or pick up a signed copy of the book, as well as pick up some of our amazing Oraculos merchandise, then by all means, come and check out NORWAC 2023, which is going to be happening in Seattle, Washington at the end of May 2023. So I look forward to seeing you all there. And we have our annual Horary Astrology Intensive coming up this summer. And the Horary Astrology Intensive is where you learn everything that I have to teach about the practice of Horary astrology. And more so specifically than Horary itself, you'll learn our Oraculos approach to systematic, clear chart delineation. I think that Horary astrology is a wonderful place within which to grow those skills. So if you're interested in learning how to become systematic and clear within your astrology, and you want a safe environment within which to practice those skills, then by all means check out our upcoming Horary Astrology Intensive, and you can find out more information for that over on our website. And lastly, at the moment, we are currently in the middle of our Oraculos Medical Astrology Intensive, and we are still open to receiving volunteer chart examples as a part of our very robust medical astrology research endeavors. So if you or someone you know has or has had a medical condition that has been very noteworthy within either your life or within that person's life, and you would like to contribute your accurately timed birth charts to our larger medical astrology research endeavors, then by all means, check out the link down below, which is the link to our medical astrology research page, and you can fill out the questionnaire over there. Or if you want to connect with me directly and you really have a medical astrology story that you want to share and you have an accurately timed birth chart, then also I'm going to put our email down below so that we can schedule a one-on-one conversation about that. Now, without further ado, here's the Aries Ingress for the year 2023. Do enjoy. Okay, so here on the screen, we have the Capricorn Ingress chart for December 22nd, 2019. And you may be thinking, WTF? Why are we looking at the Capricorn Ingress chart for December 2019 if we're here with the intention of discussing the Aries Ingress of 2023? And the reason for that is because I've been a bit of a delinquent astrologer in terms of talking about any of these ingresses. And I also really want to give us a bit of context about what's going on and also about why we are looking at these charts to begin with. So just to really orient ourselves in time, I want to take a look at the Capricorn Ingress of December 2019 in order to orient ourselves in what's actually been going on for the last few years so that we can see where we are right now at this predictive moment in time. Also, I think that a big part of doing this is also showing us how the astrology has been reflected in the charts of larger moments of global history, so that when I introduce the Aries Ingress chart for 2023, we feel a little bit more open about not necessarily believing what that chart says, but we feel a little bit more open to understanding the mechanisms of these ingress charts, and so that we could also feel a little bit more okay in terms of accepting some of the things that we see coming up in these ingress charts or in the Aries ingress chart for the year ahead. So on the screen right now, we have the COVID-19 announcement chart, and this is the chart for Wuhan, China. And the information for this chart is December 22nd, 2019, 12:19 p.m. in Wuhan, China. And I wanted to take a look at this because I think that it really expresses on a large scale level something that was occurring on the ground of Wuhan, China during this particular ingress. And so, as in all forms of traditional astrology, what we're going to focus on here is the ascendant. And the ascendant of this chart is 29 degrees Pisces, 20 minutes. Now, that degree is a very monumental degree of the zodiac in general. And it's a very big statement degree. A big part of the astrology that I do isn't just astrology proper, but being the magical, mystical person that I am, I'm also very inclined to omenology in general. And by omenology, I'm referring to seeing an omen and knowing that that omen has interpretive value, even if it doesn't actually tie into the realities of what I would normally do in terms of my step-by-step systematic chart reading method. So here, the very first thing that we see in this chart for Wuhan, which is the chart for very near to when the first cases of COVID was announced at the end of 2019, we see that all of the angles of this chart are at the 30th degree of their respective signs. And we know that 29 degrees of any of the signs is the 30th degree of the sign because of the difference between ordinal and cardinal numbers. So basically, all of the angles of this chart are at the last degree of their respective signs. We have 29 degrees Pisces rising, 29 degrees Sagittarius on the midheaven, 29 degrees Virgo on the descendant, and 29 degrees Gemini on the fourth house cusp, the IC. And the final degree of any sign is known as the anaretic degree. And that word anaretic is coming from a classical word, anareta, and that anareta is meant to express a destroyer, or it's meant to express a great devourer or a great hunger in a sense. We see the anaretic degree on the four angles of this chart. And whenever, for me at least, within the context of my natal astrology, if I see the ruler of the ascendant at the anaretic degree, it feels as if that person is living their lives in a constant state of crisis. And that's one of the things that I invariably always default to thinking whenever I see the ruler of the ascendant at the anaretic degree. However, this isn't the rule of the ascendant. this is the ascendant itself. Now, usually I would say, well, is this a correctly timed birth chart? If we have 29 degrees rising, did someone fudge the birth time? And is it actually 0 degrees of the next sign? Or is it 28 degrees of the sign it's in? Because 29 degrees is a very tricky degree in general. However, there is no space for the fudging of a birth time because this isn't actually a birth time. This is actually the exact moment of the Capricorn ingress. So it's a pretty accurate chart. So what we see with this 29 degree on all 4 of the angles is that this chart is built within a petri dish of crisis. And I think that that's a very important thing for us to hold in mind, especially as we think back to what was occurring within the world and what was particularly occurring within Wuhan, China at the time of the COVID-19 outbreak, and knowing that Wuhan itself was really at the center of this major global crisis. And so we see the chart of this event happening within this container of crisis in a sense. Now, as we continue to go through this chart and investigate the ruler of the ascendant in this chart, we find that the ruler of the ascendant is Jupiter at 4 degrees Capricorn, 24 minutes in the sign of his fall in the 10th house of the government. Not only is the 10th house of the government and the leading political party in a sense, but the 10th house is also the most visible house within any chart. And the ancients thought that the 10th house was a far more powerful house to be in than even the ascendant, especially in questions that had direct impact on visibility. So if you're going to ask the question, will I ever be famous? The 10th house, seeing the ruler of the ascendant in the 10th house, is a far more potent place for fame than even the first house, because the first house is still under the horizon, so you can't actually see what's going on there. So here we see Wuhan in the 10th house, which is representing fame, and it's also representing global recognition. And it's there in the sign of its fall. When a planet is in the sign of its fall, it's as if that planet has fallen head first off the top of a mountain, and it has no parachute and it has no ability to actually save itself or protect itself or brace itself for the impact even, because it just has nothing at its disposal to actually assist it. So here we see the ruler of the ascendant in this chart for Wuhan in the 10th house. And in mundane astrology charts, the ruler of the ascendant is indicative of the people of the country, whereas the ruler of the 10th house is indicative of the leaders of the country. And here we see the ruler of the ascendant is the same planet as the ruler of the 10th house. In other words, as goes the leadership of the country, so too goes the people. And we see that both people and leadership of the country are in an extraordinary state of debility. Not only that, we also see in this chart the Jupiter in a conjunction with the South Node. And as many of you know, the South Node is one of the parts of a chart that I call the toilet bowls of astrology. And the toilet bowls are the South Node, the 12th house, Neptune, and the Southern bending. All of those things collectively, I consider to be the toilet bowls of our astrology. And so the Jupiter is conjunct the South Node, saying that not only were the people weakened and debilitated within this period, but also the government was weakened and debilitated within this period. And neither the people could help the government nor the government could help the people, because both of them were in this deep state of debility. It was a very sad state of affairs that unfolded within China, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, and also as we moved through 2020, and we saw a lot of hate towards Asians and also hate towards Chinese people in particular, really coming to the surface as we moved deeper into the heart of 2020. So it was a very painful period of human history, and it was definitely a very painful period for the Chinese people in general. Now, if we take a look at aspects to this Jupiter, we see something interesting. And one of the things that I never tend to do within my own approach to astrology is I never actually give signification to Chiron for much of anything, truthfully. And the only things I tend to give signification to Chiron to are things that directly pertain to my research. So I've never read anybody else's book on Chiron. I've never studied anybody else's work on Chiron in particular. And the only person whose work on Chiron I actually give a damn about is my dear friend, Faith McInerney, in New York City, who I just think is a fabulous astrologer. But beyond Faith, I've really never paid attention to what anybody else has had to say about Chiron other than myself. And so Chiron, within the context of this chart, doesn't really fit within the sphere of things that I've particularly researched Chiron about. I've researched Chiron in relationship to people's relationships with their mothers. Very often, 9 times out of 10, a person has moon in a square relationship or in any sort of hard aspect, including an exact quincunx to Chiron. We oftentimes hear very terrible stories about that person and their relationship to their mother. In fact, I just heard one today. There was a lady who had the exact quincunx of Moon and Chiron, and she had an awful relationship with her mother. And there was more story surrounding that, but that was basically the gist of that story. So I usually don't use Chiron beyond the very specific spheres that I've studied Chiron in or through. But one of the things that I have been able to confirm about Chiron is Chiron's relationship to sickness. Very often, if a person is having Chiron conjunct the 10th house cusp, that can be a person either working within the medical field, or a person who's working with sick people, or a person who hates their very stressful job because of how stressful it is, but yet they still find a reason to love it because they feel as if they're contributing to the collective. Very often when people have Chiron square their nodes, it has to do with the moment it has to do with people who are working with the sick or something to that effect, which is very much the case with people who have Neptune square the nodes as well. Neptune square the nodes has to do with sick connections. Therefore, having that square with the nodes is also having some indication of working with the sick. So those are the things I usually tend to use Chiron for, but I find it fascinating that within this chart, in which sickness was really on everybody's mind, and sickness was definitely the thing that brought Wuhan, China into the global arena in terms of our consciousness of, well, let me speak for myself. It was one of the things that brought Wuhan, China into my consciousness because previously I hadn't known about Wuhan, China. We see that the people and the government, by way of Jupiter ruling the first house and ruling the 10th house, have a square relationship to Chiron, which Beginner's Guide to Astrology would tell us has a connection or can be interpreted as sickness that is infecting the people, or sickness that is impacting the people, as well as sickness that is impacting the government. There's also a very isolative story about Chiron, and I think that that is very much a part of the story of Wuhan, China for this period of time, because there was also this demand essentially for people to isolate and for people to isolate at home and really separate themselves from others. And that is definitely also a big part of the narrative that I found to be true about Chiron. So there you have it. Another interesting thing about this chart is that if we look at the declination table for this chart, we see we have Venus in a parallel relationship with Saturn in the declination table, and Venus parallel Saturn on a natal level has to do with separation in love. And on a global level, it has to do with separation from partnerships, or it has to do with separation from people. And I think that's further indicative of this narrative of isolation that we found coming up, or this necessity of isolation that we found coming up within the context of the pandemic. Now, the last thing I want to say that's interesting about this chart is that we have the sun at 0 degrees Capricorn, 0 minutes, conjunct the 10th house cusp essentially. And in this chart, the sun is ruling the 6th house of sickness. And I think that that's very indicative of the fact that sickness was really the national agenda for Wuhan, China, and for China as a nation in general during this period of time at the end of December 2019. Curiously, here we have the Capricorn ingress chart of the sun for Beijing, China, which is the capital of China. And I wasn't aware of how distant Wuhan was from Beijing. I was expecting both of those charts to essentially be the same chart, but it isn't. In the Wuhan chart, we have 29 degrees of Pisces rising, and in the Beijing chart, we have 2 degrees Aries, 53 minutes rising. And in this chart, lo and behold, we have Chiron conjunct the first house cusp, Chiron conjunct the ascendant. Now, from a natal astrology perspective, that can possibly be interpreted as someone who is isolating or someone who finds the need to self-isolate. They don't necessarily feel that deeply connected to people around them. They might feel like a bit of an outcast. They may not necessarily feel as if they are the most beloved amongst their peers. And all of that ties in with our understanding of mythological Chiron in a sense. And while I don't usually always rely on the mythology of the planets as being indicative of their meaning in a concrete sense, that is definitely something that we find with the Chiron narrative, this feeling of being unmothered, or this feeling of being an outcast, or this feeling of being unloved. And so for Beijing, the capital of China, we find Chiron conjunct the ascendant. Couldn't possibly be more conjunct the ascendant within this Capricorn ingress of the sun chart for the end of 2019. The reason why I'm looking at the Capricorn ingress chart is because there's one school of astrology, and in particular Uranian astrology, to which I belong, that says that the year actually begins when the sun has ingressed into 0 degrees of Capricorn. Therefore, our International Astrology Day should actually be at the Capricorn ingress as opposed to the Aries ingress. And it kind of makes sense because when the sun is ingressed into Aries, the sun has already come halfway upward back towards the ecliptic from his lowest point of declination in relation to the ecliptic. So it seems more sensible to judge the beginning from when the sun is at his lowest point in relationship to the ecliptic, as opposed to when the sun has come to his halfway point at the ecliptic. And we do know that the second furthest distance the sun can attain from the ecliptic is when the sun ingresses into Cancer. So Cancer doesn't necessarily seem to be where the beginning of the journey should be, because when the sun ingresses into Cancer, the sun is basically already halfway through his journey in relationship to where he was at 0 degrees Capricorn. So there are those amongst us who feel as if the Capricorn ingress chart is a far more telling chart in terms of the annual predictive event structures of the year ahead. And regardless, all 4 of the cardinal ingress charts, the ingress of the sun into Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn, have been used since time immemorial, essentially, in order to divide the year into 4 segments. So in any event, whether you subscribe to using the Aries ingress chart as the beginning of the year, or if you're using the Capricorn ingress chart to analyze this last season of the year as we're using it to analyze it right now, both of those things essentially bear great predictive value. So here within this chart, the one thing that is curious and that does stand out is the fact that we have the Chiron conjunct the ascendant, which we could think of as being sickness comes to the people, or isolation comes to the people, or a sense of being separated from the larger global community is coming to the people of Beijing, China. And like I said, the capital of a country is often used as being the proxy to represent the entire country. So this could be a sense of separation or segregation or isolation of the people of Beijing, China, that they really experience as a result of having the Chiron conjunct the ascendant. Even if you don't believe in Chiron, we still have the ruler of the 6th house of sickness conjunct the midheaven within this chart, and that is further bringing up this narrative or this feeling of sickness being a part of the national agenda. Furthermore, if we take a look at where the people are located, we see the people of the country as represented by Mars, ruler of the ascendant, in the 8th house. And we know that in traditional astrology, the eighth house is the house of death as well as debt. And from a mundane astrology perspective, the eighth house is having to do with the death rate of a country. And so we have Mars here within the eighth house, signifying that death could also be a very big part of the national agenda of the country at this time. And so we saw sickness already being a large part of the national agenda. And we're also seeing now death possibly being a huge part of the national agenda that the people of this country have to grapple around. Another thing that's interesting within this chart is that we have the moon in Scorpio in opposition to Uranus in the first house, and that moon is ruling the fourth house. And the fourth house within this chart and within mundane astrology is representing the actual ground beneath people's feet, is representing the real estate, it's representing the land. And it can also be an extension of the people because the moon is representing the vox populi. So here we have the moon in the sign of her fall, which on one hand is indicating a great state of distress of the land that these people find themselves in. And the opposition to Uranus is only further indicating the fact that this distress came about suddenly. It kind of came out of nowhere, and it came as a major shock to the very fabric of the Chinese people. We also have the Venus as a part of this T-square and the part of sickness also as a part of this T-square, which could be used to indicate that sudden sickness befell the people of China that had very large financial ramifications through Venus ruling the second house within this chart. But it also had the effect of splitting the Chinese people from their international partners or allies as a result of the Venus ruling the seventh house in this chart. And very often the seventh house is having to do with the people across the ocean. If the first house represents the people in my country, then the seventh house is representing the people across the ocean. And we see that those people across the ocean are very much a part of this Moon-Uranus opposition story, as is the part of sickness, which the part of sickness is actually on the screen as a little bit of a fluke. It wasn't intentional by any stretch of the imagination, but because we are currently in the middle of our medical astrology intensive, it's a part of every chart I look at now. And while I wouldn't base an entire assessment on this, I do find it to be a curious fact that the part of sickness was very much a part of this T-square combination that we see between the moon ruling the fourth house and Uranus in the ascendant. Moving on. Here we see the actual Aries Ingress chart for the US, which would have been right around the time that the US was announcing a nationwide lockdown as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And within this chart, some of the interesting things we find is that we have the part of sickness rising. Now, once again, this is purely anecdotal. It really was a fluke because it wasn't my intention to have the part of sickness on any of these charts, but I find it interesting that within this year, when sickness was really key on the agenda of the US people, we do find the part of sickness playing a huge part by being in the ascendant. We have Mercury squaring the part of sickness. We see that Mercury within this chart is ruling the eighth house, which is once again the house of death. And Mercury is also ruling the 10th house, which is the house of the government. Now, Mercury in Pisces is possibly one of the most challenging astrological placements because Mercury is both in the sign of his detriment as well as his fall in Pisces. So if we were to interpret that Mercury as being the leadership of the country during the COVID-19 pandemic, we can say that the leadership of the United States of America was really working beyond the scope of their range of understanding in terms of really knowing how to figure out or how to correctly deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm sure that many of us remember that during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I say during, but at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we were getting a lot of mixed signals regarding how we should conduct ourselves and regarding how we should proceed. And a lot of those mixed signals really came from high up the political food chain. And so I think that this could be indicative of the fact that there was a lot of confusion within the government. The government didn't really know how to conduct itself. And it was really a difficult time because it was a time that was met by a great deal of death. And it was a time that was met by a great deal of death by sickness. And no one actually knew how to navigate this moment of history. It was a very stressful period of time in general. We see the ruler of the ascendant in this chart is represented by the Mars in Capricorn in the second house. Mars in Capricorn in general is something that we tend to like. We tend to think that Mars does very well in Capricorn because that's a sign of Mars's exaltation. But what we see going on within this chart as well is that we have the South Node in the second house as well. And from a natal perspective in Renaissance astrology, we would say that having the South Node in the second house is destructive to one's monies, and it is destructive to one's ability to hold on to a great state of financial well-being. And we know that during the COVID-19 pandemic, many workers got furloughed, many people were just unemployed. And we know that previous to the COVID-19 pandemic, things seem to be very good economically within the United States. There seemed to be a moment of general economic prosperity. But as we moved into 2020, we found that definitely taking a nosedive. And we see that not only through having the South Node located here within the second house, saying that no matter how much we get our head above the water from a financial perspective, we still feel like we're being pushed right back down because the South Node in the second is very similar to having a hole within the national economy or a hole within the national pocket. Secondarily, we also see the ruler of the second, Jupiter in Capricorn, in the third house. Now, by the 5-degree rule, which is a traditional astrology rule, a planet that is within 5 degrees of the next house cusp and in the same sign as the next house cusp can be considered to be in that next house. And so we have the Jupiter, the Pluto, and the Saturn in the third house, essentially. And this Jupiter-Pluto-Saturn combination is a combination that really was a very difficult combination in general. And for many people, where this combination showed up in their charts in 2020 really represented the major source of crisis that they experienced in their life during 2020. And so the monies by itself does not seem to be doing very well because the money is in the sign of its fall. And a lot of people genuinely felt that the money of the country was in the sign of its fall, or that the money of the country was in a state of disrepair. And we also see this Jupiter ruling the fourth house cusp, which is further saying, or it's further elucidating or pointing in the direction of the money as well as the physical infrastructure of the country being in a state of disrepair. Therefore, the Mars in the sign of its exaltation in the second house may show the people of the country's willingness to get back on their feet financially. But within the petri dish of that willingness, we do find these things that are directly antithetical to anybody getting back on their feet from a financial perspective. Okay, so one more point I wanted to share with you all about the Aries Ingress chart for Washington, D.C. for March 2020 is that if we take a look at this chart through the lens of Uranian astrology, it really speaks loudly to what was going on within the country during that time. So let's hop over to the 90-degree dial. So here we have the 90-degree dial of Uranian astrology, and it comes to us directly out of that German school of astrology. When we're looking at the 90-degree dial, there are 6 points that are called the personal points that we specifically investigate in order to really root ourselves in the concrete realities that the dial is representing for the person, place, or event it's meant to describe. And one of the things that I found fascinating was that if we go to the ascendant on the dial, we see 2 things coming up. So one of the things is that we see the ascendant falling on the Saturn, Neptune midpoint. And what that looks like is this. Saturn, Neptune midpoint, and it is literally minutes away from the ascendant, probably 15 minutes away from the ascendant. So we'll add that point. Another thing that we see is that when we have the pointer on the ascendant, we have Saturn and Uranus equidistant from this dot between them. And because we're working with midpoints, if they're equidistant from the dot, that means that they are also resonating with the ascendant itself. So we'll add that point. So now what we have is the ascendant equaling Saturn, Neptune, as well as the ascendant equaling Saturn, Uranus. We also have the moon a part of this structure, which really makes it very personal because once again, the moon is representing the people of a nation. Saturn, Uranus equals ascendant means being placed in difficult circumstances, the fight of standing alone in the world, suffering difficulties caused by others, experiencing emotional suffering with others, mourning or bereavement. That's what the Saturn-Uranus combination signifies. Furthermore, Saturn-Neptune equals the ascendant is described as an emotionally depressing environment, oppressive family circumstances, emotional suffering caused by other persons, limitation of freedom. That definition comes to us from the combinations of stellar influences by Reinhold Eberton, who's the founder of cosmobiology. But Reinhold Eberton really based that book off of the rules for planetary pictures by the founder of Uranian astrology, Alfred Witte. And Alfred Witte describes Saturn-Neptune equals ascendant as disease of other people, to be infected, to vaccinate. Isn't that fascinating? That for the Aries Ingress chart for Washington, D.C., March 19th, 2020, we have one of the most personal points, the ascendant, falling on the actual midpoint that has a direct implication of not only becoming sick from other people, but it is also the midpoint of vaccination. So I just thought I had to share that with you because astrology is fascinating. Now we move on. Hopefully you'll forgive the history lesson. And I know that a lot of the things that I'm speaking about aren't necessarily things that any of us really want to relive or things that any of us really want to continue to breathe life into. But another major event, and I was sitting down with Andre trying to figure out, hey, Andre, what's the top events that have occurred in the world essentially since 2020? And I tend not to be that connected to global anything or to the global political landscape. So there have been many more things that have occurred clearly between 2020 and now. But one of the major things that really caught our attention was when Russia invaded Ukraine. And we got the announcement of that in February. And for those of you who know me, you know that I tend to have a fuzzy barrier between when exactly a predictive chart, such as the Aries Ingress chart, comes into effect. And one of the things that we saw within this was that even though it happened in February, we really see the evidence of this manifesting within the Aries Ingress chart 1 month later. So here, the reason why I showed you the announcement of the COVID-19 pandemic from Wuhan, China, was because in that chart, we saw this similar petri dish of chaos or this similar petri dish of crisis by virtue of all of the angles of the chart being at the 30th degree. And here we see that being true as well for Moscow, Russia, which is the capital city of Russia. We see that being true for that country as well. Within this chart, we also find the people and the government once again being the same because we have Mercury ruling both the first house and the 10th house. And within this chart, we find the people and the government being here within the 6th house, which is on the one hand, the 6th house of stress. It's on the other hand, the 6th house of slavery. And it's also a house of things that we unnecessarily put ourselves through because we feel as if the collective requires us to put ourselves through those things on its behalf. So the 6th house is both the house of slavery that is enforced upon us, but it can also very much be the house of slavery that we enforce upon ourselves. And so we have this image, once again, this very stark image of Russia being in a state of a great amount of stress. And we have Russia also applying to the ruler of this sixth house of stress, which is saying to us, it feels as if the stress that's occurring within the country is ongoing. Now we have Jupiter. It's pretty wide, but we do have the Jupiter in an applying conjunction with the Neptune. And the Jupiter-Neptune combination is a combination that I've often referred to as the Jesus complex or the Messiah complex. Because when you have Jupiter-Neptune, and once again, this is a very general statement, a full assessment of the entire chart is definitely necessary, but very often when people have Jupiter-Neptune as a prominent feature within their charts, they want to save everyone. They want to do everything for everyone. And a part of saving everyone and doing everything for everyone is having a blurred sense of where you end and where everybody else begins. So within this Aries Ingress chart for Moscow, Russia, there could have been a sense or this conflated, possibly delusional sense of what constituted right action or what constituted right action on behalf of the world. Because when we have Jupiter-Neptune, we think that what we're doing is something that serves the greater good of the entire world at large. However, Neptune is always a planet that has the ability to lead us down the path of wrong action or misaligned action or confused action. So us having the people and the government applying to the ruler of sickness and stress, applying to Neptune, further brings up this feeling of us not really being able to respect our own sense of what makes us us, and also us not really being able to respect another group of people's sense of what makes them them. We also see that the Jupiter is the ruler of the seventh house, and the seventh house, once again, is representing from a natal astrology perspective our partners, but it's also representing our open enemies. So having the Mercury applying to the Jupiter is saying that there is someone who seems to be applying to another person, and we don't necessarily know if that's for the purpose of creating love or if that's for the purpose of creating war. The declination table tells us that we have Venus and Saturn in a parallel relationship, and the Venus-Saturn parallel relationship has more to do with the separation and the severance of relationships than it has to do with love. We also have Uranus smack dab in the center of that Venus-Saturn parallel relationship. And so from a midpoint perspective, we can read that as Venus/Saturn equals Uranus. The definition of which is temporary infatuation, a quarrel between lovers, a sudden separation, sudden separated love, short harmonious union that then leads to separation. If we had to really clarify what we think that represented, we could very well say that it seems far more likely, based on the Venus-Saturn-Uranus combination by declination, that what was being taken to the people across the ocean was a state of warfare and not necessarily a state of coming togetherness. We will also note that a big part of that war has to do with the inability to respect the sovereignty of other people. And the Neptune is very much coming with that sort of information. We have the Neptune in the conjunction with the seventh house cusp, but essentially we have ruler of the first house, ruler of the seventh house applying to that conjunction to Neptune, which is saying that there's a real national sense of there being blurred lines between who we are and who our opponents are, and we're blurring those lines in such a way that it doesn't actually allow us to know our own set of boundaries, but it probably also isn't allowing us as the leadership of Russia to respect the right to sovereignty of another country's boundaries. So that's one of the ways how we can interpret that. The final thing that we see here that's noteworthy, in my opinion, and it's definitely not the final thing, but one more thing that we see here that's noteworthy, in my opinion, is the fact that we also have the moon at 29 degrees Libra, 53 minutes. So we have the angles of this chart functioning within this petri dish of crisis, but the moon, which is meant to represent the people themselves, is also operative within this petri dish of crisis, which does not actually feel as if it's allowing anybody to be able to find peace under the auspices of this Aries ingress of the sun for Russia for March 2022. Now, that finally brings us to where we are. Now that I've shown you all the efficacy of not just the Aries ingress chart, but also the cardinal ingress charts in general as being a predictive tool in order to describe the event structures for a particular capital and by extension the country to which that capital belongs, let's take a look at the Aries ingress chart for March 20th, 2023 in order to describe the year ahead for the American people. So the very first thing that we see here is that we have 7 degrees Virgo, 35 minutes rising. We don't have anything in the ascendant at all. So we're going to go directly towards the ruler of the ascendant. The ruler of the ascendant is Mercury at 3 degrees Aries, 24 minutes in the 8th house. Now remember, initially we spoke about the 8th house as being the house of death as well as debt. So one of the first things that we think about is that both the death rate of the country becomes a very large topic of discussion within the mind of the American people within this coming year. And we also feel as if debt, the general lack of finances, becomes a very large topic of discussion for the American people within this coming period. One of the things that we see here that we've seen previously is that we have the rule of the ascendant and the rule of the 10th house being the same. And therefore, we have this sense of, as go the people's concerns, so too goes the concerns of the rulership of the country, which, even though that sounds like the thing that should happen, isn't necessarily the thing that always happens. So here we have the people and the leadership of the country this year in the house of death, the death rate, as well as concerns about money, which could also look like concerns about increased taxation or concerns about an increasing cost of living, and that being a very large concern for everyone at this time. And this is further corroborated by the fact that we have the ruler of the 8th house in the 10th house, which is saying not only are the people physically concerned with death and debt by virtue of their presence in the 8th house, but also the 8th house and its agenda becomes the national agenda by virtue of us having the ruler of the 8th house in the 10th house. Now, Mars in Gemini isn't necessarily the greatest place in the world for Mars to be. And when we have Mars in Gemini, from a natal astrology perspective, especially in the later degrees of Gemini, it can cause a person to have a great amount of franticness or anxiety. And it can also cause a person to have a great amount of mental turmoil or mental turbulence. So here we see the Mars in Gemini in the 10th house, which could say that the state of what America does with money and the way in which what America is doing with money possibly also contributes to American debt could be a real source of turbulence for the American people within this coming period. Now, we see that Mars is also ruling the 9th house, and that 9th house is the house of foreign affairs from a mundane astrology perspective. So possibly a part of why the American people are feeling so pressured monetarily this year is because there's this thought amongst the people, whether it's true or not, is yet to be decided. But there's this thought amongst the people that the American coin or the American money is going out to support other people's agenda, or it's going out to support international or foreign agendas that don't necessarily have anything to do with the actual integrity of the soil beneath the feet of the working class American citizen. So that could be one of the ways how this manifests. We see this further corroborated because we have the ruler of the 2nd house Venus at 4 degrees Taurus, 45 minutes, located within the ninth house, which is once again bringing up this sense that the money of the country is going out and supporting things for other people. And it's not just any old money, it's the good money of the country, because it's Venus in the sign of her domicile conjunct the North Node. So it's the good money of the American people going out and supporting international affairs that may not necessarily feel germane to America, or that may not necessarily feel as if they have much to do with America. So here we see this state of possibly a financial crisis, and that financial crisis specifically circulating around the American people, asking the government essentially, what are you doing with our money? Where is our money going? And why is it we find ourselves at a disadvantage as a result of where you're shipping our money off to? And the reason why I use this language of shipping our money off to is because we do have the rule of the second house in the ninth house here. Speaking of international affairs or foreign affairs, we have the ruler of the ninth house in a square relationship with Neptune. And when we have the ruler of the ninth house in a square relationship with Neptune, it says to us that our foreign allies or our foreign partners are probably finding themselves in a very weakened or very debilitated state to begin with. And as a result of our foreign allies or foreign partners finding themselves in that weakened or debilitated state, it makes us feel that much more beholden to them, or it makes us feel that much more beholden to assisting them or helping them get beyond the hurdle to reconstitute themselves or refortify themselves. Because as we look at the foreign partners of America within this coming period, through the ruler of the ninth house being in a square relationship with Neptune, it seems as if they have received, in a sense, a mortal wound that is causing them to lose vitality quickly. And as a result of that, it does feel like a help effort in order to support these other people, in order for them to support themselves. But at the same time, when we look at the money, once again, we can take a look at the money through the part of fortune, because the part of fortune is a proxy of money, whether we're looking at it through a natal chart or if we're looking at it through a mundane chart. The part of fortune is a proxy of the money of the people. We see that Neptune is about to perfect its quincunx to the part of fortune in the 12th house, which once again is saying the people are concerned about what is going on with the money. Why is our money in our 12th house? Why does it seem as if our money isn't actually being used to serve our needs? And furthermore, why does it seem as if we're continuing to experience a loss of our wealth, which we could interpret by virtue of the money in the 12th house picking up the quincunx from the Neptune? We will also note that the moon in mundane astrology is having to do with the vox populi, or the voice of the people. And so we even see the people universally signified by the moon being in the seventh house. Once again, in mundane astrology, the seventh house has to do with the people across the pond. So if the first house is representing me where I am, then the seventh house is representing everybody else. So the seventh house is also representing the sense of our foreign partners. It could also be our foreign opponents, in much the same way as the ninth house is representing foreign affairs in general. So much of the United States agenda within this coming period seems invested out of the United States, that it's possibly reasonable that the people are feeling this sense of debility and probably not the clearest sense of national pride at this moment, because they're really not sure whether or not the nation is in direct support of their own needs or of their own well-being. Another thing that we find within this chart is that the ruler of the first house is in an exact square relationship with the part of sickness. Now, usually, once again, I would not bring up the part of sickness within mundane astrology. However, it was a customary practice within traditional astrology to bring up the various Arabic parts, or rather to bring up the various lots, as they're also called, in order to describe more specifically various parts of a person's life and destiny, or various parts of a nation's life and destiny. And so, what this can be indicative of is homegrown sickness and illness can proliferate within the coming period that brings heightened anxiety and fear. The reason why I bring up this notion of sickness being homegrown is because it's in the fourth house. And the fourth house is representing the land, it's representing the soil beneath our feet, it's representing the rock that we feel patriotic about. So there could be a sense of a homegrown sickness that is proliferating within this coming period that's bringing up a sense of anxiety and fear. And we've already noted that the people of the country this year are in the eighth house. And by virtue of being in the eighth house, there's already this sense of there being a greater concern around debt and taxation, but there's also this additional sense of there being a great concern around the death rate of the country. So possibly we're finding another insurgence or another occurrence of something from a health perspective that is negatively affecting the people or the country, or that's rising to the top of the agenda. And it need not necessarily be COVID, it could be something else. But here we can see evidence of something that is homegrown here within the country that's becoming a point of anxiety and fear and crisis from a health perspective within this coming period. Now, as I had spoken about previously, Neptune blurs the lines and it makes it difficult for us to identify where we end and where our allies or our partners begin. So once again, we have this Neptune in the seventh house in much the same way as we found the Neptune for Russia in the Aries Ingress chart for Russia for 2022 in the seventh house again. So we wonder whether or not there is actually a clear sense of who the country of America is versus the people that the country of America may be reaching out its hand to be of assistance towards. Now, we know that we live in this global ecosystem, and a part of that is being able to support others in need. And that definitely seems to be a major part of the American agenda within this period. The question within that becomes how much generosity becomes too much generosity, and does the generosity of the country end up making the people of the country feel as if they're at a disadvantage? Another corroborative factor that we see in this chart of this is that we also have the sun in the eighth house as well. In an Aries ingress chart or in any cardinal ingress chart, the location of the sun can often indicate what is going to be a major area of concern within that period. And so here we have the sun in the eighth house of Washington for March 2023. And so it's further corroborating that not only do we have the people in the eighth house of death, debt, and taxation, but we also have the sun in the eighth house of death, debt, and taxation. And the sun within this chart is ruling the 12th house. So there feels to be something subversive, or there feels to be something that's actively working against the country, as we find the country in this eighth house that genuinely represents things that don't really feel the best. In the eighth house, just to further this narrative, we have the ruler of the fourth house, and we know that the fourth house is having to do with the land. And so having the ruler of the fourth house in the eighth house could further be indicative of the fact that the price of real estate is probably also having people in a greater state of debt, or we find the price of real estate is skyrocketing within this period, which is also tying into the anxieties and the eighth house fears that we have within the country within this coming year. One of the most stark things going on in this chart is that Pluto is at 29 degrees Capricorn, 57 minutes in the fifth house. This is Pluto's last hurrah, in a sense, before ingressing into Aquarius. I don't really like the last hurrah for any planet, but I definitely don't feel very easy about the last hurrah for Pluto in the fifth house. The fifth house from a mundane astrology perspective is representing the children of a country. And so to see Pluto making its last hurrah within the fifth house of the children of the country seems to be a bit unsettling, and it could really make a massive transformation in terms of how the country views its children, about how the children view themselves. And it could be a huge moment of discomfort in relationship to the children of the country. And Pluto, as we know, is a planet that when Pluto takes something away, it isn't very likely to give it back. That's just a part of the narrative of Pluto. And so we are wondering whether or not there are crises that we will face within this coming period within the United States of America in relationship to the children. And a part of why I was hesitant to talk about this is because I think the level of just violence and brutality and crime that we've seen occur within this country towards children has been so overwhelming over the past few years that it seems commonplace that within a given year of modern America's history, there's going to be some major crisis or there's going to be some major outbreak of chaos surrounding the protection of children or what's going on with children. I didn't want to talk about it, but it is here. We see it in the chart. And so it's something that we can continue to look at throughout the year by virtue of transits and by virtue of other predictive methods to see when this is most likely to bear fruit. But it does seem as if it's a massive problem. We also have the Pluto and the quincunx relationship to the part of fortune in the 12th house, which is once again furthering this narrative of debt. Because while Pluto can represent a great deal of money, Pluto also can represent a great deal of debt if it isn't in positive aspect with a planet that signifies money. And here we see Pluto in one of the worst aspects with one of the proxies of money within this American chart, which is probably really making us wonder whether or not we are on the verge of another major moment of debt within the American economy. Speaking about the children, we have the children within this chart represented by Saturn at 1 degree Pisces in the 6th house. And that could be indicating that the children or thought about children become a major source of stress within the country this year. And that could possibly also be thought about the safety of children becoming a major source of stress within the country this year. It's the 6th house. And so we wonder whether or not that has to do with sickness as one of the potentials. We see the Saturn also in a sextile relationship with the part of sickness. But beyond that, we're wondering what is the major crisis that is occurring within the country this year in direct relation to the children, and why is it seeming to be such a moment or such an event? Once again, we think about omens as astrologers as well. And this Pluto at 29 degrees Capricorn, 57 minutes on its last gasp, as it were, in Capricorn in the 5th house is making us wonder what will be the grand finale that we have surrounding Pluto regarding the children of the country within this coming period. We also have the Venus within this chart representing the money of the country in a sextile relationship to Saturn. So possibly as one of the good news pieces that we can get out of this chart, we have the ability to pour money into children, or by virtue of the crises occurring within America in relationship to children, that will probably be the thing that recenters the American monetary agenda and brings it back home to the nation, because there is a realization that that money needs to be poured into the children. So I think that this is one of the positive things that we see coming up. We see a remedial measure being taken in relationship to where the American money is going. And even if that remedial measure comes up as a result of crisis, it also brings the funds back home as a means of supporting the children within this coming period. So here we have a tool that is known as the polar azimuthal. And the polar azimuthal as a concept was created by Arthur Blackwell. And the software Nova Chart Wheels that we see was created by one of my mentors, Gary Kristen, who was a student and a colleague of Arthur Blackwell. And according to Arthur, he thought that the polar azimuthal was the astrological chart format of the future. We know that astrology has gone through several chart formats throughout time. We have had the square chart format, then we had the round chart format. Then in the early 20th century, the Germans pioneered the 360-degree dial and the 90-degree dials as another chart format. So Arthur Blackwell thought that this polar azimuthal was the chart format of the future. And one of the things this does is it shows us Paran relationships between planets. Now, while that's an entirely different topic that requires quite a bit of explanation to get into, a Paran is basically a relationship between stellar bodies in relationship to various parts of the horizon. So we also call these mundane aspects. So as far as Parans are concerned, we can have a planet that's rising on the eastern horizon and also a planet that's culminating at the meridian. We can have a planet that is culminating at the meridian and another planet that is similarly setting on the western horizon. We can have a planet setting on the western horizon and a planet rising on the eastern horizon. We can have a planet rising on the eastern horizon and a planet anti-culminating on the lower meridian. And all of these combinations are called mundane aspects. So because this is mundane astrology, we're going to take a look at some of the mundane aspects. And because mundane aspects just work in any form of astrology in general, we're going to take a look at them. Now, one of the things that really stood out for me is that if we were to pull the moon around and take the moon around to the red circle, this red circle is indicating the horizon. We see that the moon is rising at the same time with Neptune. Here's our moon, here's Neptune, and here's the eastern horizon. And we see the dot of the moon, the dot of Neptune, both co-rising. And so we would call that a co-rising or a Paran relationship between the moon and Neptune. So even though they don't actually have a conjunction in the zodiac, they do have this relationship that is similar to a conjunction by virtue of their co-rising. And the co-rising of the moon and Neptune could really just indicate that this period that we find ourselves moving into with this Aries ingress is a very confusing period in general. Neptune for the American people, the moon. So we have a confusing period for the American people that's coming up within this coming year. And that's what we see here through the co-rising of the moon and Neptune. Now, another important one that I really thought was interesting was that we have Mars as a part of this combination as well. So we have Mars anti-culminating at the same time that we have the moon rising and Neptune rising in the sky. And we also have the sun as a part of this combination as well. So there are many things that are telling us that this moon, Neptune, Mars, sun combination is going to be very much a part of the agenda for the American people within this coming year. One of the things that we see with that is it can indicate irritability. It can also indicate weakness. But in particular, Mars-Neptune can indicate us putting our energy towards the wrong efforts. There's this notion of Mars and Neptune, whereas Mars has a lot of energy and power, and Neptune is just full of confusion. So when we bring those two things together, we tend to make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes can be mistakes due to sloppiness or mistakes due to not really paying too much attention. But it can also be mistakes because we put all of our energy towards efforts that aren't actually the best and that aren't actually in support of us at the end of the day. The final thing that I want to talk about within this that I think is really interesting is that if we take this Mars on a ride around the chart, we see that when Mars is rising, we have Saturn exactly at the midheaven. And this is a powerful and a potent combination. Mars-Saturn in particular is one of the more malefic combinations in astrology in general, because both Mars and Saturn are the lesser and the greater malefic respectively. And so when we see these two planets coming together, it makes us feel as if we're moving into a period of explosiveness. It makes us feel as if we're moving into a period of potential destruction. And it also makes us feel as if we're moving into a period where there are large outbursts of people's energy and of people's anger and of people's frustration, because it feels like all of these emotions are coming to a bottleneck and as if they finally want to explode out and express themselves. And this is something that we find coming up within this period, the Mars-Saturn mundane square, with the Mars rising and the Saturn culminating. And so this, added to everything that we've said previously, seems to be the icing on the cake for a very tricky and a very difficult year that we have ahead of us to navigate. And within all of this, we see this continuous echo of the same sort of story. And that story is a story of disillusionment amongst the people, a misallocation of funds that really has the people feeling like they're not really taken care of, which could catapult the economy into a state of debt. We see an increase in terms of taxation in general, and that property, as an extension of that, also becomes more expensive. We also see a great amount of anxiety being held surrounding the welfare or the well-being of the children of the nation. And within all of that, we also find ourselves in a Moon Neptune moment. And while the Moon Neptune has the ability to bring with it a great amount of dissatisfaction or disillusionment, the Moon Neptune also has the ability for us to broaden and expand our hearts, and for us to realize that our well-being isn't just a singularity, but that our well-being also ties into the well-being of others around us. So we see this moment ushering us into a space that is admittedly uncomfortable, but it's also a space that allows us and that gives us the opportunity to ask the question, who else can we assist? Who else can we serve? Who else can we help? And in this moment where it seems universally uncomfortable, where all of us seem to be having our back against the wall in terms of the state of affairs globally, even within that, the Moon Neptune is giving us the opportunity to ask ourselves, how can we serve? And while that question, how can we serve, may seem like it isn't the most appropriate question in the world to be asking, especially when we find ourselves in a state of survival, especially when we find ourselves not necessarily knowing which way to turn, especially when we find ourselves stressed out and really wondering what is going to happen next within the country and how the changes within the country will directly impact who we are as a people, we still have this moment to cultivate a spirit of open-heartedness. And within that open-heartedness, through a spirit of helping, through a spirit of healing, through a spirit of asking ourselves, who else can I serve? Even in this moment when I myself feel as if I need to be served, it allows us to broaden our particular bubble of suffering or fear or anxiety in such a way whereas we realize that somebody else also needs assistance. And when we can step out of that bubble of fear and anxiety and worry long enough to help somebody else, it also has the effect of lessening some of that fear and anxiety and worry within our own hearts. So, while 2023 seems to be bringing us choppy waters this year for the American people, for the country of America, for the people who America reaches out to be of assistance to within this period, we also have this seed of a genuine humanitarian interest being funded within us that allows us to expand our interests beyond our own tiny plot of land to see how we can take care of others. And if all of us take part in that work of taking care of others, then we stand to create a brighter 2023 for us all. Thank you all so much for sitting with me and meditating with me and reflecting with me on the year ahead for the USA for 2023. One of the things that happened for me within this entire process was it really showed me how the astrology that we practice is versatile and it can be applied within many settings and to many ends and for many purposes. But it also showed me, and I hope it did the same for you, it showed me that these countries that we think of as these monoliths, in a sense, these countries are also living organisms. And these living organisms that we call countries, they too have their stories, they too have their joys, they too have their sorrows. And when we step out of the realm of our specific natal based astrology and start to realize the larger implications of our astrology, we realize that we are all a part of one large living body and that our individual stories contribute to those larger stories within which we find ourselves placed. But those larger stories within which we find ourselves placed directly echo back and also influence the shaping and the living of our own lives. So I hope that you've gotten something from this mundane astrology prediction for the year of 2023. And I hope that within all of this, you find a reason to broaden your heart, to keep yourself open, to not blind yourself from the needs of another as you go about your own means of survival, but that we all open our hearts to be the keepers of each other so that we can build a brighter year for all of us. Until next time, I am Mychal A. Bryan, leaving you in peace and love and hope. Until we meet again, have a good one. Bye-bye.